Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for what must be one of the most exciting sessions today. The Giga Green Revolution, is it finally here? I'd also like to welcome everyone who has joined us virtually for this presentation. We look forward to the questions that we'll get, both from the audience in the room as well as people who have dialed in virtually. So, a little bit of an introduction, first of all, to the topic. We all know that wind and solar development, other renewables, have been with us for a while, but there is a great issue, our need for reliability. If we're ever going to be able to scale up the use of renewables, we need to do much better in terms of the capacity for those renewables, for renewable energy, to contribute to baseload. So what we're going to do on this panel is a deep dive into some of the challenges, not just in terms of the technology and what might be holding us back, but how easy it is to finance this transition. What are the financing considerations? How are geopolitics impacting on all of this? There's quite a lot to dive into. Without any further let me get into the introductions. Louis Taylor, Head of UK Export Finance, Anna Barrias, Aurora Research, Tom Stenhouse, who joins us as an investor from Aberdeen. We've got Penso Power, Andrew McAlevey, and Alper Kilic, the Global Head of Project and Export Finance at Standard Chartered. What I'd like to do, it's a little bit unorthodox and unusual, but I think you yourselves are best placed to share with the audience what perspective you'll bring to the discussion today. So starting with you, Louis, UK Export Finance.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for having me here. So UK Export Finance, the UK government's export credit agency. So I bring a bit of a governmental perspective on this, but also a pretty commercial financing perspective on it, because we work alongside partners like Standard Chartered in helping to finance projects, most particularly in developing markets. The perspective we bring to this is perhaps from the governmental one, that the UK government has been a leader in pushing for the green revolution. It's fair to say that has been really successful in the use of renewable assets like offshore wind. The climate is less conducive to solar, but nevertheless, we are quite strong on that as well. But there are other elements as well that the UK government is really pushing on this from the point of view of developing technologies. And it's the propagation of those technologies that really brings an almost moral dimension to what UK Export Finance does, because unless we trade, unless we propagate those technologies globally, we're not going to achieve net zero, which is a global endeavor. So I think the UK government and certainly UK Export Finance really sees the opportunity here, as well as some of the costs, but we can talk about that. The opportunity certainly outweighs the challenges.
Thank you, Louis. Anna?
Yeah, thank you very much. Anna Barrias, I'm Head of Iberia for Aurora. Those of you that don't know Aurora, we're an energy market analytics company, so we focus on long-term forecasting. So I will try to add some numbers to the discussion. So we like to quantify things, and I hope that we can bring some numbers and some facts to the conversation today.
Hi there, I'm Tom Stenhouse from Aberdeen. We're a $500 billion asset and investment manager, and the purpose of being part of this panel from my side was trying to explore how we create innovative solutions for clients and for capital. And as a big real estate owner, and I sit within the real assets division, we have 50 billion of assets. It's going the whole way through the investment cycle, from one of the occupiers to our end LP and our investors. And within the Giga Revolution and the green energy, how is that playing out? How do we get to net zero within both our buildings, but also within the asset class? Where does that sit within real estate or infrastructure, or is it a hybrid between the two? And so for us, it's going with our investors, looking at the returns and trying to analyze where we see opportunities and how we can effectively support and work alongside, again, government bodies in what we need within the UK and wider European appeal in that investment class.
Thank you, Tom. Andrew.
Thank you. I'm Andrew McAlevey from Penso Power. Penso Power is a specialist battery storage developer, owner, builder, operator. What I hope to bring to this panel today is we very much view battery storage as a key enabler of the green revolution. Battery storage helps deal with the intermittency challenges that wind and solar presents, as mentioned earlier. And from our perspective, we're in the front line trying to develop, finance, and build these projects, and hopefully I can bring some of these insights to the panel today.
Thank you. Alper?
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you to our clients and partners. It's great to be here together. I'm looking forward to I'm sure what will be a very good panel. So obviously I'm representing Standard Chartered Bank. The perspective that I hope I will bring to the table is, one, I guess, how we see the green opportunity and with this, giga revolution that is hopefully is about to take place from Standard Chartered's perspective, but also in terms of the bank market. So I run a project finance business. Bankability is the word that we live in and out every single day. So hopefully I want to share some perspective when it comes to the bankability of some of these giga projects that we're hopefully about to discuss. Thank you.
Excellent. And Anna, let's hear from you now. I believe you have a presentation for us to serve as an introduction to the topic.
I do. I promise I won't make this death by PowerPoint, so hopefully it's interesting. So I was asked to give a little bit of context on the conversation. So what I'll do is I'll refer to an analysis that we did on the challenges of decarbonizing kind of Europe by 2030. So try to focus it not on 2050, but kind of near term. What do we need to do now to kind of get there? So as you all know, the EU has set an emission target of reducing emissions by 55% from 1990 levels by 2030. Now, this will put pressure on supply chains, on capital, on minerals, on permitting, on the whole lot. And so what I want to do is explain a little bit how that looks like by focusing on a couple of those topics. So first, in terms of kind of where we are and where we have come from. So a 30% reduction in emissions was achieved between 1990 and 2019. Now, a further 35% reduction is needed in a third of the time to get to those targets. So what that means is that Europe decarbonized 57 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year in the last kind of few years. And then it will need to do 2.4 times as much in the next 10. So going to 136 million tons of CO2 per year. Now, this is Europe, which has done more and has done it faster than many other regions in the world. So by talking about Europe and talking about how challenging it is, you can extrapolate to what that means for the rest of the world, of course. So the analysis that we have done is estimating kind of the amount of renewable capacity that you would need to add to the system in Europe to decarbonize across different sectors and using different technologies. So I'm doing a very quick summary of that and focusing on a couple of key points from it. I will say that as high as the numbers are that I will be presenting, this is actually a conservative estimate because one thing we haven't included, for example, is hydrogen and the need of more renewables to develop kind of green hydrogen technology. So, keep that in mind when I talk about the numbers. So if you look, for example, at the annual additions of wind that would be required to get to the 2030 targets, we're talking about 27 gigawatts per year of wind. Now, that is 2.3 times what has been done historically. And by historically, I mean over the last 10 years or so. When we talk about solar, we're talking about 24 gigawatts per year, which is 4 times the historical deployment of the technology in Europe. And then we also need batteries. We need something to provide flexibility to the system. And we're talking about 3 gigawatts per year, which is 4 times the historical deployment. Now, of course, what that means is that there will be implications on networks, on capital deployment, clearly, on mining, on permitting and development, and on the market design and the system operability of the market. So I'll focus on 2 of those for now. The first is capital deployment. So we have worked out that you need about 565 gigawatts of renewables and 32 gigawatts of batteries to get to the targets by 2030. At the capex estimates that we have at the moment, that's about 519 billion just on those technologies this decade. Now, that's a conservative estimate, I must say. That doesn't fully account for the huge increase that has happened over the last kind of 6 months or so. So as you know, CapEx has gone up by about 30% for renewables in the last 6 months. So this is conservative already by those measures. Now there's networks, and people in my industry don't talk a lot about networks, but a huge investment in networks needs to happen to be able to enable all of these renewables to come into the grid. Now, this varies very significantly by country, depending on the status of the network and what additional investments would be needed. So the estimates are somewhere between 0.75 and 2.8 billion euros per gigawatt of renewables. So if we take the conservative estimate of 1 billion per gigawatt across Europe, then that gives you an additional 565 billion that needs to be invested in networks. So that's over 1 trillion just in the next decade that needs to be deployed to get to very conservative estimates of what is required. Now, just as a benchmark, that is bigger than the combined capitalization of the top 10 EU utilities and the top 10 EU banks. So not only do we need to do more with the capital that exists at the moment, but there will be more sources of capital that need to come in to get to this target. Now, the other thing I wanted to bring out, because again, it's not talked a lot about, is mining. Now, decarbonizing via electrification will lead to significant increase in the demand for critical minerals. What this graph shows is just a couple of those kind of minerals to make that point. So first, you have global copper demand. Now, of course, everything is wired with copper when you think about the renewable industry. And if you look at what would be needed just in networks, based on the numbers that I highlighted, we would need to double the amount of mining that is done for copper. Now, that in itself is not necessarily a problem. The resource is there. But the average time that it takes from discovery to production of copper in a mine is 17 years. So we have 10 to get where we need to get to. So this is clearly something that's a challenge. Lithium is, of course, another challenge. We need to increase lithium production by about 6 times in the next 10 years to get where we need to get to. That's not even kind of talking about kind of nickel, cobalt, and other kind of rare earth minerals, of course. Now, a lot of innovation is happening, and we might talk about that during the panel, around different technologies, batteries, for example, to reduce how much is required from some of these minerals. But this is obviously a challenge. And then related with that challenge is the geopolitical nature of mining in many ways. So beyond the impact of stressed supply chains and costs, obviously, that come from that rapid growth that needs to happen, you also have where these minerals are located and where they're mined and where they're produced and processed. So what this graph shows is the top 3 critical mineral producing regions in the world. So again, just to highlight a couple of them. So Chile and Peru are the largest producers of copper, followed by China and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The Democratic Republic of Congo also produces over 80% of cobalt, according to the IEA. So now this is important because things like mining safety and sustainable mining practices are particularly acute when you move away from a region like Europe or other more developed regions. Now, lithium production is fairly spread throughout the world, but it's very energy intensive. So if you extract lithium from rock, then that requires a lot of energy. If you extract it from brine, then that requires a lot of water. So sustainable practices around lithium production are also kind of very difficult. And then, of course, you have processing capacity, a lot of which sits in China, which, of course, complicates things with just the relationship of China with the rest of the world. So in summary, what we have is the fact that Europe has been incredibly successful in decarbonizing kind of so far, but what is required over the next 10 years, what is required through 2050 and beyond, will stress all of those things that we have done fairly well over the last kind of several years. First, on networks, there needs to be an investment framework that allows for the required amount of capital to be deployed in networks. There's capital deployment, of course, that there's two critical things there. First, policy development on new technologies to incentivize things like hydrogen, for example, the way we did with renewables, and that has gotten us so far on that technology, but also regulatory stability. And as somebody that looks at Spain, for example, and Portugal, this is something that's absolutely critical if we want to incentivize investment in what will be technologies that have a lot of merchant exposure. Mining, I think it's time to kind of cast the sustainability net wider when we think about renewables and think about the upstream implications of all of the investment in renewables that need to happen. Permitting and development, a lot of the bottlenecks throughout Europe relate to the permitting process. So transparency around that is incredibly important to make sure that we accelerate development the way we need to. And then, of course, there's things that probably matter less to people in this room, but are also important around the system operability. Well, it's not true. That matters a lot to people in this room. System operability is obviously key. Things like batteries, flexibility are absolutely needed to integrate all of those renewables into the network. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, for giving us that overview of the topic. And I think this leads very naturally to a question for Andrew and the development of battery technology. Where are we, from your perspective? Is this going to be more of an evolution than a revolution? What kind of challenges do you foresee?
That's a very good question. Clearly, batteries have been around for a very long time in one form or another. And if you look back over a very, very long time, the cost and performance of those batteries has been getting better year over year, decade over decade. Currently, we are absolutely in a bit of a supply chain crunch. I think the explosion of EV demand has led to an unprecedented increase in demand for batteries and a lot of the raw materials that drive those. The good news is I believe the large battery manufacturers are continuing to innovate. I think they will continue to innovate. Taking a technology from totally new to market, it often takes decades, but I think what we're talking about here in the battery market is evolving or adapting existing solutions. So I do think that over the coming years, battery chemistries will continue to evolve. I think the reliance on lithium, will decrease. I think lithium currently has some chemical characteristics which lend itself well to batteries, particularly high energy density batteries, but it's a cost-benefit trade-off. At some point, lithium becomes so expensive that other chemistries are able to solve that in a cost-effective way, especially when it doesn't have to be energy dense, such as in energy storage. So I do think it's a challenge today. I think it will be a challenge in the near term, but I'm confident over the longer term, the industry will innovate and find solutions which help facilitate this revolution.
Thank you. So we're still staying with the theme of revolution. Maybe this is a good time to ask the investor the question. The big concern must be that the cost of this is going to go down over time. Technology is changing very rapidly. There is an expectation that over time, perhaps it becomes more affordable. How do you invest into something like this? And where do you see the risks? What sort of mitigants would you be looking for?
Well, I think Andrew made a very interesting point with the word innovation. And I think that's probably where we are right now. And with Anna's reference to the sheer scale of the money needed in the sector, our thinking is how do we get that money and how do we create the products or the opportunity for investors to come into? And I think that's not an easy one to answer right now. It's at the forefront, particularly in light of cost inflation. If you're going to build a big manufacturing plant right now, the world's got to have a lot more difficult, not just cost inflation, but also interest rates on the borrowing side. And also, how do you take the lending environment along that journey if you're at the front end of that? Lenders are all there and they're willing to go on the journey, but they're probably not the front of that. And I'm sure that'll bring in the UK government aspect on it. So for us, it's trying to probably break it down into components. And it's also understanding the whole chain and evolution. You know, if you're buying real estate and you buy an office building, you understand your tenant matrix, your rental and your leasing prospects. I think where we're going now is you're having to understand the supply dynamics, the demand dynamics, where they're sourcing the cobalt. Is it ethically sourced? You want the ESG angle. You're probably playing around with a dozen different components and much wider, but it comes back to the real estate. If you can produce the energy, how do you feed your own real estate with ESG credentials? So I think we know we want the output. The question is, how do we get comfortable with the initial input and the creation of it? And that's, I'm not sure we're grappling, we're creating that opportunity, but I think each day that goes by, we probably evolve and innovate within that, but we're not there yet.
So things are constantly changing, and from an investment perspective, this is just something you've got to keep up with.
Without a doubt, and I think, you know, we're particularly focusing at the moment around the batteries and the electric vehicle side, and there's a lot of EV charging going on. You know, if you have a Tesla and you're out there charging, a lot of service stations for Teslas, but is that infrastructure in place for other cars right now, yes or no? I think probably the answer is no. So we know what we need to get to. We know we need a solution, and the money is there. Let's be honest, there is a significant amount of equity in the world chasing returns. Are they the right returns, or how do we de-risk it to get the right returns that level up with the opportunity?
So turning to you, Alper, some of the financing challenges, having heard the perspective of a developer, an investor, how do you see the bankability of these projects?
Let me start with a positive note. I think, you know, I quite agree with Tom in the sense that capital is available. Certainly, the macro, you know, economic environment is changing in terms of, you know, increasing interest rates and whatnot. But still, equity capital is available, and then the debt capital is also available, certainly. Now, then of course the risk return becomes an issue, right? So if you look at the scale of the opportunities, and since Razi, you suggested that we do this more of a conversation, I was wondering if it is possible to bring you know, Anna's slides. There's slide 5. All of them I liked a lot, but slide 5 I would like to refer to, quite a telling you know, story there, I suppose. But that sort of gives us the opportunity, and I do agree that it's a more of a conservative, I suppose, estimate. I think you said over $1 trillion, sort of the dollars, but probably if you look at the whole supply chain, right, from the mining to production to sales to transmission, that the scale is much bigger. So the capital is there, opportunities are there, but then how do you make these bankable, right? Now, that's the risk piece then comes to mind if I switch my hats, right? In the sense that, just to give you an example, right? So for the audience as well, some of the discussions we have with our risk management committees is that, okay, you are telling us the opportunity, absolutely, and Standard Chartered made a big sort of the public statement. We said that we will help finance $300 billion by the end of the decade when it comes to transition financing and green financing. Quite a substantial amount, and we are not the only one. Other banks are making similar statements as well. So the opportunities are there, and the bank made a commitment, right? But then we also know that some of those projects will not make it, right? Whether it is from a technology perspective or from a bankability perspective. Therefore, we need to be selective, right, on behalf of our shareholders and our clients. So how do we then look at the right projects and ensure that they're bankable so that the capital goes to the right projects? So if you look at this slide, the market capitalization of the utilities and the banks, right? So that gives me a very sort of this, I suppose, strong indication that the bank financing is not going to be sufficient only, right? Institutional investors, non-bank investors, capital will have to be there, but also very strong support from the governments and MDBs and DFIs will have to all come together if we are going to finance the required investments over the next sort of a decade, right? So from that perspective, I suppose that the different elements of the capital providers, whether by making the regulation in such a way that, you know, they are supported, regulated in an investor-friendly way, or having the export credit agencies like UKEF coming and providing long-term support to the banks, you know, certainly they will play a very important part. And I suppose the last piece I will indicate is that there has been good examples, right? if you look at what solar and offshore wind were in Europe 10 years ago, and if you look at the evolution of the bankability of those projects in the last 10 years, there has been a huge, huge success, right? The price of the tariffs have come down, costs have come down, and we can confidently say that those transactions are structured in a very bankable way. So there are lots of lessons learned, maybe not exact replication of what we have seen in the solar and wind, but very good examples learned when we look at the next 10 years with regards to the new technologies.
So encouraging to hear that things are moving in the right direction in terms of bankability improving. And you touched on a very key point, government support, the role that governments can play in making the transition happen. Louis, over to you. The UK has been one of the leaders, certainly in terms of offshore wind power. That didn't happen accidentally. Can you tell us a little bit more about the UK government's initiatives?
Absolutely. I mean, what a rich discussion, and you know, almost it's boggling where to come into all of this. So look, I totally appreciate Anna's €1 trillion for Europe. The reassurance I kind of take is that not all of that trillion is incremental spend. There's a lot that otherwise would have been spent on replacement capex or renovation capex. So it's not an incremental trillion. Of course, it's a trillion, and don't get me wrong, the incremental number's huge, but it's not quite as daunting as it otherwise might be. And for the UK, certainly, we're not building any coal power stations and haven't for a long time. We're closing them down. And, you know, we've been able to create regimes that have allowed incredibly attractive returns to be made on offshore wind. And I think that Anna's 5 categories, 5 big boxes that have the regulatory regime embedded in that is absolutely right. And trying to harmonize those across the world is really, really important to the bankability of a lot of these deals. So the UK government is not least of all, really trying to encourage, particularly in developing markets where these regimes don't exist at all, let alone exist in an attractive way for investors, to be able to adopt those. And even the private sector is doing this. So Rolls-Royce is talking about small modular reactors. Their offering will not only be the reactor and the turbine and all the physical stuff, it'll be an overlay of a regime on nuclear management for countries that have never had a nuclear power station. And these things will all help with the bankability of these transactions. But I think that in the end, what we, certainly at UKEF, the UK government's financing offering is not to solve everybody's problem by throwing all the money at it, because no sovereign can do that. And that's the issue. The private sector is absolutely fundamental to all of this change that is going to happen. And the private sector is stepping up in terms of quantum of money. There's loads of liquidity, but the risk appetite behind that liquidity isn't really there to be able to do what the liquidity is supposed to do. And so a lot of these projects, particularly in developing markets, we see need some form of de-risking. Not by an organization like UK Export Finance guaranteeing the totality, because that's just going to give you a government rate of return, not an equity investor rate of return on a power project. But for us instead, to try and use a pretty surgical application of finance or of risk-taking to de-risk projects, whether private investors don't like the quality of the offtake agreement on an electricity project, whether we could guarantee the power purchase agreement, or whether we could put a 15% first loss piece in there, and we took a big slug of that and de-risked it that way. Finding ways to catalyze private money into de-risked projects in developing markets is really what we're going to be trying to do increasingly across developing markets. I could go on, but I'm going to hold up there.
Thank you, Louis. I think that gives us a wealth of information that we can build on with this discussion. My question for you, Anna, related to this is, from your research, what has been your experience of the receptivity of governments to doing things differently? Where do you see the bottlenecks? The UK has clearly emerged as something of a leader in this regard. Is there something that can be replicated easily elsewhere?
Absolutely, and I think it's fair to say that it does vary significantly across Europe and obviously across the world. I think the UK, there's a lot of things that the UK has done really well when it comes to providing a framework for the investment of renewables. One is very clever design of mechanisms, including the CFD. I think that's a mechanism that people look at globally as an example of a mechanism that has been well designed, that enables capital to be deployed, that is not a subsidy, but it provides revenue stability under the current circumstances, and that's key. I think regulatory stability has been another very important enabler of investment, something that we don't always see, as I was saying before, in other countries. That's something that, for example, when you look at Spain, they have done a lot of good things, but a lot of the regulatory changes and the uncertainty that the constant regulatory changes bring to investors means that people are hesitant to invest in new technologies. They're hesitant to invest in existing technologies that are proven and have no technology risk. Obviously, the hesitation to do things like hydrogen is even bigger. So I think the clever designs of mechanisms and the regulatory stability is something that has worked very well and that clearly is absolutely critical to get to the levels that we've talked about.
Thank you. And Tom, from an investor perspective.
Yes, I was keen to probably comment off the back of Louis' comments, because I guess we're in discussions with UKIB right now, which is a new institution, which is doing, I think, just exactly what you said. We know that the lenders are there to come. They like the product. They like where we're going, but it's almost not quite there yet. So it's a partnership between the capital, the UK government trying to facilitate something, saying we can help get it across the line. Once we de-risk it, you're going to be fine, and we'll help you go on that journey. But I think it is very much a partnership. We've seen it from the real estate now playing into real estate infrastructure, where your occupier, your LP, the government, the banks, you're actually all in it together. You know what you want to create, and actually you can have some very honest conversations. And people are open because they want to access it. They want to provide the liquidity, and everyone knows what cost of return they've got. The only question is, how do you get from here to there, and who goes first, and how do you get there, and how do you de-risk it? But it's a very different way of approaching things, because it is a bit like a partnership really now between the different entities.
I totally agree with that. And I think the other element of this, if you move it from just the UK, which is, you're right, it is a total partnership there. This is a global partnership. Yeah. And the issue about net zero is it's going to require consistent collaboration from every government in the world for the next 30 years. Yeah. Fundamentally, no issue there really. And all of this kind of works in a very liberal, open environment where a market can drive down prices on the marginal cost of electricity and can drive towards the best regulatory regime. But if you have political fragmentation and ideological change, like we might be seeing out of Ukraine, Russia, and all of that, this is not going to be any easier. So that collaborative partnership element and fostering that is a critical element. And maybe another bucket to add, Anna, to this, the sixth bucket is the real sense of partnership.
Yes. So we actually have a question from the audience on precisely this issue that I'd like to put to the panel, and I welcome any intervention from the panelists. With most of the needed materials for energy transition coming from countries that may not be politically aligned with Europe and the US, do you think current circumstances, the partial end of globalization, maybe a slight retreat would be a better way of putting it, trade disruption due to geopolitics, is this going to stop or severely disrupt any aim for energy transition in the decades to come? So are we looking at a really, really difficult set of geopolitical circumstances right now? How do you see the energy transition given this? Maybe, Louis, you raised the issue.
Go on, yeah, have a go at this. So I speak as a civil servant rather than a politician, I should just say. Look, I mean, the words inflection point are often used, but we are at an inflection point, and it's fundamentally unclear what the answer to the question is. But I think that there are two elements here. Firstly, if the West is too strong with developing markets who are not necessarily totally aligned one way or the other on this thing, that you're either with us or against us, the risk is they get pushed away from liberal Western democracy, which has its messiness, but it has its real advantages as well. Because actually, if you're a relatively autocratic government in the developing market, the China model, which has quite a lot of economic liberalism, but quite a lot of governmental control, is really quite an attractive option. And, we've got to be kind of careful not to push people away, firstly, which brings us on to the second point, which is which way does China go in all of this? Does China really want to be respected in the world, or does China want to be feared in the world, crudely characterized? And that is a really difficult thing to know where they go. I know what I really hope. And if they do go that way, then things are a lot easier.
I just echo
Andrew?
what Louis was saying. I was just looking at more broadly. I think there's no doubt that the globalization and the global supply chains have delivered huge benefits globally to consumers, to electricity manufacturers, to all elements. And any interruption of those, not necessarily emerging markets, but we buy a lot of battery components from China today, and if we had to buy them somewhere else, they'd be more expensive. So, for me, that's my concern. Less to do with the developing markets that source a lot of these raw earth materials. I think there will be long-term solutions to that. I think the broader disruption of supply chains could have knock-on implications and inflationary pressures, not just in power, but in all elements of society.
It's certainly creating a cost environment that must come as a significant constraint to developments right now.
Correct. There is no doubt that due to short-term supply crunch, it is resulting in quite significant price inflation for all elements of our projects. Our expectation is those will start to normalize over the short to medium term, but there is no guarantee that they will. And the more tension, the more barriers that are put in place, the longer those inflationary pressures will exist. So, that is certainly one of my concerns. If there is more barriers put up, that will ultimately hurt consumers and hurt the green revolution.
What can be done to try to ride this out? Perhaps a bit of an unfair question, but I'm sure we have many minds on the panel who are focused on this.
I mean, I think you mentioned one already on technology improvements and just kind of, investing enough in understanding what alternative ways there are of doing some of the things that we're doing with the minerals that are coming from this kind of difficult places. Processing capacity of some of these things in Europe, obviously, and there's a lot of manufacturing that is now kind of starting to come out of Europe, for example. So I think all of those things will help. I mean, I think there's also, the current situation with Russia, for example. I talk about another inflection point, has also shifted again Europe into, a perspective on security of supply that was a long time coming, but hadn't happened and probably would not have happened if it wasn't for this situation. So I think, there's also a benefit in some of these things and making sure that we accelerate things that are just long overdue. I think in this situation, the decarbonization of Europe, moving away from Russian gas, is something that should have been done a long time ago, and this is just something that's accelerated. And there's many benefits to that, right?
You've highlighted a big question that's come up in the chat, and this is, do current geopolitical tensions in Europe accelerate the growth of investment in renewables? In the short term, it seems Europe needs more brown energy sources to combat the spike in energy prices and overall inflation. And this seems like a bit of a step back from the decarbonisation goals. So I'd like to open that up to the panel. I think Alper has an intervention.
Well, perhaps a story to share. Right? So from a European perspective, I'll share my thoughts in a second, but maybe related to the first question as well. A few weeks ago, we were in Washington attending sort of the client meetings around the IMF spring meetings, right? And we had a meeting with the Indonesian delegation. We met with the Minister of Finance from Indonesia along with delegation, and I was accompanying our delegation led by our chairman. In my mind, going into the meeting, I had a couple of questions, and in relation to the transition, right? Indonesia, one of the biggest coal-producing countries. We are very keen to help support them in the transition, and we have done, a couple of successful transactions in green energy. Right? That's what I had in mind. So as we started the conversation with them, obviously the inflation pressures, consequence to growth, we all started talking about. And I said, Minister, if you look at the current, market background, what is one thing that is, bothering you? What is in your mind? She said cooking oil. She said, at the moment, there's a big issue in the country to provide cooking oil. And that was a Thursday. 2 days later, Indonesia banned exportation of palm oil from the countries, right? Now, if you look at from an emerging market perspective, and you know, a bank like ours, of course, the issue, very question is very close to our hearts and minds. I had a couple of meetings with our clients from Africa yesterday, right? Oil producing countries. Now, they have a slightly different perspective, right? The oil price is where it is. They use this as a great opportunity to help their economies, and they have huge needs. Now, coming back to the European question, perhaps whether it is, you know, diversification from the agenda, I don't think so. Simply because there is no other option, right? Whether it is the Russian war, whether it is the Indonesian finance minister's current view, short-term views may be different. But I'm not even saying long-term. In the midterm, there is no other option. Everybody will have to invest into the transition. Everybody will have to invest into green technologies. And it will, yes, it will be perhaps more costly than what we had envisaged, right, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, because since 2014, if you look at the offshore wind, if you look at the solar across the world, tariffs have been coming down, you know, cost of production have been coming down, and perhaps it's not going to be like that over the next 2 years, 3 years. But in terms of the bigger agenda or strategy of going back to green energy, green transition, I don't think we have an option. So we're going to have to find a way to support that.
So the current geopolitical situation, something of a bump in the road, but it doesn't derail the whole need for the transition to happen. And you still see everyone aligned in that direction. A related question for you maybe, Louis, is it the security of energy supply that is currently trumping climate considerations? How do you see this progressing?
So the UK government's policy for the last year and a month or so in relation to overseas fossil fuel projects is that we're not going to finance them at all. Not gas as well as not oil or coal. And truthfully, that policy was forged in the heat of being COP president, which the UK still is. And as UK Export Finance, we just don't touch hydrocarbons anymore. And actually, it's made our lives a huge amount easier because spending time trying to land a hydrocarbon project responsibly takes a lot of time. We're just not focused on that anymore. It's clean and green, and that's all great. In terms of what's happened now, I mean, nobody's moving back from net zero by 2050 because the science tells you that's the end point. There isn't any more runway beyond that, and there's a carbon budget between now and then. Of course, the front end of this looks a bit different, but actually, it's not like there isn't enough energy around to be able to supply the world. Of course, there's a cost to it, but actually, maybe it's one last opportunity for the countries with developing markets with oil reserves who actually had a really pretty poor COVID with low oil prices and a fiscal demands and all the rest to have a bit of recovery, actually, and for the rest of the world to rely on them rather than on investing now in new hydrocarbon capacity that's going to take 2 to 3 years to come on stream anyway. So far better to focus on the green stuff and to, not to develop the hydrocarbons anymore.
Anna, in terms of your research, how do you see this developing?
Sorry, what is it?
So, on the one hand, there's been a big geopolitical disruption.
Yeah.
Hydrocarbon prices are right up there. If we're looking at refined fuel, even more expensive than crude oil. Everyone is scrambling to try to react to this. Yeah. There are concerns that this disrupts the energy transition. Yeah. What are you actually seeing from your research? Is it that everyone's still thinking big picture, stay away from fossil fuels, let's focus on cleaner, greener energy? Or is there a real risk that in the short term, in the heat of the moment, all of the political pressures that come from higher oil prices, this is being forgotten about?
Yeah, so I think, what I've seen is a recognition that there's a short-term reaction that's needed. And in some cases, that might mean, extending or running some of the coal plants a bit more than anybody would like, really. But I don't think it's derailed any of the long-term plans from governments. If anything, as I said, I think it's accelerated some of those plans. I think another thing that the current situation has done, and I think as an industry, we haven't been fully transparent and probably honest with ourselves, is that there's a cost to this transition. And the cost of this transition will impact vulnerable customers significantly and disproportionately. And I think, the current situation has made that come to light. And I think as an industry, we have the responsibility of making sure that people are aware of that and that that's being managed. Because what happened now, it's a knee-jerk reaction to, kind of consumer bills are really high. Now we need to sort this out. But the reality is they were always going to increase to be able to enable some of the investments that we need. And so I think in some ways kind of focusing on that and developing the policy to allow the transition to happen, but mitigate some of the effects on the most vulnerable is something that, again, was always going to be needed, and it is being accelerated and paid more attention to, which I think is a positive development.
So I'd like to get Tom and Andrew's perspectives on this. Given the current environment, given what we see happening globally, there is a suggestion that actually the green premium may be coming down. This should ultimately, long run, be a good thing. Do you see things the same way?
We have a lot of talk in real estate between a sort of green premium and a brown discount. And the debate recently was, well, do the two match out eventually? Because in theory, they should do. I think the issue at the moment is probably assets that haven't spent the money, have got to spend the money. Have they had the valuation impact yet? They need to try and bring that green premium down. And probably seeing it more from real estate than the new assets we're going to build. As a fund manager originally, 2 years ago, we'd never really, the concept of ESG was just, no one thought about it. Having gone on that journey that, probably less than my colleagues on the panel, the evolution has been so quick. And particularly with the batteries that I've been doing for 9 months, before the crisis, we were already knowing it was the right thing to do. I'm even more certain of it now. But again, how do you create that? I still think it needs a green premium to deliver the product. It will come down, but when, I don't think I could tell you right now. I think it's got to have a return angle to it that makes sense in this. It is still got a risk to it, albeit we want the product. And
Andrew, your thoughts on this?
As we are in a very green industry, but I think we're all green premium, so I don't see the difference so much. I think from my perspective, looking at the scale of what needs to be done, I think we recognize we don't get to the end point of where we need to be by doing what we've done to date. I do have a lot of hope that we will be able to make changes from all aspects in order to get that journey. I believe my industry, battery storage, was an industry that was probably not investable 4 years ago, and now very much is investable. And as we sit here today, capital is not what is holding us back in terms of deploying projects. But I also think it's very important for everyone involved in this that we do not get to net zero by people deciding to put more of their money in a green fund. That doesn't get us there. We're going to have to change how we eat. We're going to have to change how we travel. We're going to have to change how we work. We're going to have to change how we farm. We have to change. Things will cost different amounts to what they do today. So this will change every aspect of our lives. And I think from on the electricity side, I think we're probably a little bit ahead of many other industries. I think there'll be a catching up, and I think it's part of that process of understanding this is a multi-decade journey that's going to profoundly change everything we do, and how we do everything is a big part of this journey.
I totally agree with that. I mean, the way we're starting to think about this in the UK government is that the traditional view of the world with developed and developing markets just not the case anymore. As Andrew's just said, every economy in the world is going to have to be totally retooled. There are no developed economies anymore. We are all developing economies, and the mindset around that, as everybody in Standard Chartered will know very well, is very different. It's not incrementalism. It's big changes, and it's about ambition. It's about pace in a way that formerly developed economies, haven't necessarily operated in. So mindset change as well, huge.
So my question is still around the availability of financing for this, and it's great to hear that in some jurisdictions, this is no longer an issue. Alpen, my question to you is more on emerging and frontier markets, perhaps somewhat more disadvantaged by their credit rating. How does that impact their ability to undergo this transition, affordability, if at all? How do you see this working out? What do we need to do?
Sure. I think it all ties into what we have already discussed in the sense that, Louis, you made a point earlier, and you said private, institutions will have to step up, and we shouldn't expect anything from the government entities. And
expect everything.
You did say everything, to be fair, and I do agree with you, and in the sense that yes. I suppose if you look at the bankability of the new technologies, that's one thing. If you look at emerging markets, developing markets, it's another thing. So firstly, I suppose in many of those markets, the regulatory environment will still need to advance to come to a certain point that the rights of the investors, whether equity and debt investors, are protected. And once that is done, I think what we are observing is really, to an extent, good advice, and to a certain point, good hand-holding to identify the feasible projects, feasible technologies. And across, in Europe, for example, in developed markets, there's been several examples of it, right? And we are seeing very, very good perhaps one-offs in some of the other markets. I mean, I was talking about Indonesia earlier. We did a very, very interesting transaction in Indonesia. We did a floating solar power plant, 140 megawatts, together with a client of ours from Middle East. We came in as a developer and equity investor. So that's wonderful. That made us, very happy. That gave us a lot of excitement. The question that we have been asking, and I've been asking to myself, is, so that's great, one transaction, but we need 10 of these, right, in order to get to the scale that you can say that, we are finally making some move, right? So I suppose risk appetite in the bank market is changing. We all realize that we can't have the same conventional or conservative view. It has to change, and it is certainly changing. I can say that. There will be a balance, right? And that balance piece, again, where I will turn to Louis, I think in terms of the MDBs, in terms of the World Banks and MIGAs and export credit agencies, they will have to play a role. But can we be more innovative? Absolutely. We don't have to use the same products, that we have been doing for a long time. There's been great, support and help from Louis and his team from the UK government's UKEF perspective. Other ECAs and also the other agencies are stepping up to create new financing tools, right? That will mobilize bank financing, debt financing a lot more to those markets that we know that we need to support. But there will always be the point that Tom made earlier, risk return. And as long as we can come to that workable point, I guess the debt capital will have to continue. And we will certainly do our part.
So there's work to be done, but it is happening. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to ask for a rapid-fire set of responses to my last question. I think there's been broad unanimity from the panel that the climate transition is underway, that this is going to happen. Everyone is going to join forces to make it happen. And my question to you, because we want to end on a more optimistic note, is over the next 1 or 2 year horizon, what is the one thing that's making you much more positive about the transition? Louis, because you're sat right next to me, let's start with you.
Look, I would say the will. Actually, COVID caused a massive acceleration in the focus on all of this space, and then Ukraine hasn't done anything to dispel that. So I think the will is there. I think the technologies are coming, and the thing that gives me most hope is that we may have a range of renewable or clean technologies that are genuinely viable in 2 or 3 years' time, not just the ones we've got today, but others as well.
A rapidly changing space. Anna?
Yeah, awareness maybe. I think for better or worse, some of the current situation have made people more aware of kind of what needs to happen. Governments more reactive in a way to kind of make the transition happen quickly. So I think that awareness is a positive thing if we need to move as quick as we do.
Tom?
I would say appetite might go similar to the will point, but we're talking to a number of institutions who might be classed as competitors, but the willingness to work together, because they all know they want to be part of that, and that's where we need to go, is actually very joined up. And everyone you talk to agrees it's just a question of how do you get there. It's finding solutions.
Andrew?
I'd echo the previous panelists' points. I'd also say a level of education about understanding the magnitude of the problem and what is needed to get there. With the fact we're talking about the scale of the change need is good. We don't have the answers here, but let's pose the questions, and together, hopefully, we'll be able to find the answers.
Alper, final word.
Well, my children. I have twins. They're 19 years old. My daughter is putting us under a lot of pressure to go more green every day, to use our car less, to buy effectively. And my son is studying geography in university, and he wants to do sustainability when he finishes. So that gives me a lot of hope and energy that, everything we discussed here hopefully will tie in what they're trying to do in their lives.
So all-round optimism and the intention to make it happen. Thank you very much to our excellent panel. Can we have a round of applause for them? And thank you to everyone who's listened in. We have a wonderful session on African credit markets coming up, so please don't go away. This will get underway very shortly. Thank you all.